Welcome to my critical reflection video. My name is Jayden Duijkers and I collaborated in the production of the opening title sequence, Breakout, a tense action thriller I've produced in AS Media Studies. The thriller genre creates high-stakes tension through suspenseful, fast and slow-paced narratives designed to thrill, often featuring a knowledgeable antagonist, a vulnerable protagonist, and intense life-or-death conflicts. The film explores a protagonist in a restricted area attempting to find a classified document to find the truth of the government's secrets. He eventually does find this file, but not without trouble, as two guards enter the room to find the protagonist. After a close call with a little hiccup, he eventually escapes as the film closes to an end. The film goes through themes of mainly suspense, anxiety building, and time, as the protagonist is constantly alert of the guard's presence roaming ever so much closer. Now, let's move on to question 1. Question 1. Let's talk about genre conventions, but we should first mention, what even are genre conventions? Well, genre conventions establish certain elements that make a certain genre, like themes, character traits, settings, and the plot. The genre conventions established in the genre of my thriller film include a plot twist as the protagonist escapes, a mysterious character that is introduced in the last seconds, which also aligns with the convention of hidden identities, clock ticking as an indication of the passing of limited time in its soundscape, suspenseful music that creates suspense and excitement that quickly transitions to pure diegetic sound as the film reaches the peak of its anxiety building, the tight compact room for most of the film that introduces the theme of claustrophobia and overall heightens the anxiety, the setting that is a very dark and gloomy contrast of warm and cold cinematic lighting that constantly engages the audience in a dark room and battle against each other with the idea of semiotics, the creation of the text that is very fitting for a thriller type film and opening title sequence, the wide selection of shots that fit a thriller film, including the Dutch angle, creating the effect of realization. All of these conventions are followed in alignment to an action thriller to sell the idea of the genre's film to the viewer, as well as narrative clarity to help the viewer understand the plot, and finally, to convey professional realism to show that this is a real, genuine film. Some existing media texts that this is similar to include Pulp Fiction, which is an old classic crime thriller that uses some of the same ideas as mine. Stranger Things with the idea of mystery and using it to have the viewer on the edge of their seat. Sinners and a similar way it creates suspense in the film. And non-dialogue films such as Flowed that use techniques without dialogue to create engagement and immersion through atmosphere and visuals. However, my film Breakout doesn't only exactly follow all the thriller conventions, it also challenges some of the ordinary conventions that would be expected from a thriller film. But you might be wondering why it would be a good idea to challenge a convention even. Wouldn't that just make the film unprofessional? Well, not exactly. Challenging conventions are very common in films currently because they can subvert audience expectations in ways they won't expect, provoke thinking outside the box, and create intriguing storytelling. So therefore, the conventions I challenged include melodic or angelic music to heighten the presumed safety the protagonist feels when he escapes, that challenges it because of the contrast between high-tension elements of suspenseful music and the soothing and upbringing tone of the angelic music, as well as the overall fast pace of the film that still uses its time to create suspense, as even though thrillers are considered fast-paced, they still use slow pacing to build up tension, which Breakout doesn't follow. The unclear ending for the film also challenges with how it doesn't create a satisfying ending, but rather makes the viewer ask more questions and creates more interpretations for how the film could continue. The guard being played by teenagers under the age of 18, challenging the convention because of the inability for a minor to acquire a job. Yet they still showed maturity for the role through their proper attire, selective ties, button-ups, and work pants. And finally, no dialogue throughout the action-packed 2 minutes and 30 seconds of film that encouraged the viewer to engage with the film through visual and atmospheric immersion, emphasizing meaning, sound design, and visuals, rather than through just dialogue, which is common to build suspense in thrillers nowadays. Furthermore, representation is also implemented in the film that displays reinforced or challenging stereotypes, such as the reinforced stereotype of an all-male cast in an action film that has the exclusion of any females participating in any action. Another one being the white ethnicity being of a higher power dominating against the protagonist of darker color, and the challenge stereotype that teens are playing the roles of adults, the protagonist being a teen. Now, let's move on to question 2. To start the second question, let's first address why audience targeting is important. It's important to target specific audiences or else the media text won't get its message across to the viewer. There has to be some sort of relatability in any way possible to catch engagement from specific audiences, which leads me to talk about my target audience with the inclusion of psychometrics. I've cast an all-male audience leading to a male-specific audience, and while yes, females can also engage in the film, it is more directed towards men, as it's more common for the male viewership to be into action, as the film is also an action thriller. As well as an all-teenager cast indicating a teenager audience base, we can also include the audience that follows thrillers or the fan base of Pulp Fiction with its similarities to my film. For income groups, it's really anyone who has access to the cinemas that has the ability to see it, which can range from the upper middle class all the way to the working class. Additionally, audience engagement is also just as important to keep them watching the whole film and staying interested throughout, which I've achieved through the engagement with the cinematic look that hooks teens with all the sloppy content nowadays on social media. It's also engaging for listeners of the artist Daniel Caesar that creates relatability with hearing the music used in the film. Emotional engagement is also a factor of engagement which uses the reader's emotions to create interest and keep them engaged, such as the film's tension and suspense, in which we can link it to Steve Neal's genre theory, which Neal argues that genres are not fixed categories but dynamic constructs that adapt over time and based on audience expectations and cultural shifts. He suggests that genre films create a sense of familiarity through repetition while simultaneously incorporating new elements to surprise viewers. This applies with the idea that every new film created uses one way or another to create suspense or tension through each different story being told. My ways of engagement following with the cliffhanger at the end, which can spark curiosity. The intent to find what was on the file of the protagonist wanted so desperately, which leads to different interpretations, and the idea of finding out who was the character at the end. Was it the guard? Was it a completely new character? All of this can be linked to the uses and gratification theory by Katz and Blumler, which refers to the idea that media users, for example, those who watch television and movies, listen to radio, and read newspapers and magazines, are not passive consumers but also are active participants in the communication process to satisfy specific psychological and social needs. For the final part of question 2, we need to address the distribution of this product. Let's assume I'm an indie director who wants to gain popularity for his new film in which I can distribute the product in many ways, including streaming platforms such as Netflix or HBO Go, social media, or a theatrical release. Now, each one has their pros and cons. For example, streaming services such as Netflix have an algorithm which recommends simpler films that can also attract distracted users. Social media is the easiest to distribute, but I doubt it will reach anyone from my target audience, as social media currently targets more short-form content under 1 minute for users to comprehend with short attention spans and boost the dopamine of doom scrolling. If a user were to scroll through Instagram Reels and see my film that is 2 minutes and 30 seconds, well, most would instantly scroll away. Then there's a theatrical release, which will be hard to distribute to many cinemas around the world with such a low budget, and cinemas can only hold so much people. But I think out of all of these options, I would still go with a theatrical release. Despite the difficulty of spreading film to cinemas around the world, I can work with film industries like A24, which is the best company for indie developers and directors to distribute the film. I believe it's the best option as it would catch most engagement and I would have control over it without any algorithms from a streaming platform to take away the control. Let's move on to question 3 now. My production skills have improved quite significantly and has really enhanced my filmmaking skills. Firstly, however, I should mention that filmmaking for me has always been a passion ever since I was a kid. So I've been making personal projects with my friends for the past 6 to 7 years. So before entering media studies, I sort of already had some experience of making films. Of course, not to the quality that I've created this opening title sequence, however, it's why I'm saying that my production skills have improved heavily. Some different improvements I've made for one is camera work. Through media studies, I've learned what each shot, angle, or level and what their meaning conveys, such as shaky movements of the camera reinforcing realism and faster pacing, or lower high-angle shots that dictate either authority or vulnerability. I've learned as well how to use these different shot types to create dynamic framing, and also now have a wider variety of shots to choose from. I think it's also important to have a style of camera work that really describes you as a person. And for me, I really enjoy the aesthetic, symmetrical shots. They really speak to me and just satisfy me every time I get a beautiful looking symmetry shot. The editing process has also heavily improved, and I can go on and on about how each edit made in my film creates meaning, which I will because my grade depends on it. So let's run through this quickly. The suspenseful soundtrack and matching the cinematic hits with the start to a new clip for smooth transitions and overall more professional take. The Bram in the soundtrack matching the reveal of the main character to convey the urgency of the situation and create tension. The addition of sound effects collected from YouTube for doors or cabinets opening, and the drop of a soda can to emphasize their importance and a realistic approach. The inclusion of the time ticking throughout to indicate the time running out for the protagonist, and as the soda can drops, the ticking stops, which highlights the idea that the protagonist's time is over. A seamless transition from the guard's back to the protagonist to maintain narrative flow and keep the viewer engaged. The blurry effect surrounding the protagonist as he finds the confidential file he's looking for to create realization and emphasize the tension of time running out as it slows down the pacing. As well as adding 2 trailerizes, one just as the guards enter the protagonist's room, and one for when the soda can drops to emphasize their importance as well as create anticipation for the viewer. The sudden, quiet approach after guards enter, enforcing the idea of the suspense at its peak. The melodic music to idealize the protagonist's short-lived victory of escaping and letting go of the claustrophobia from the small room as the theme of freedom is introduced. The title appearing as the music reaches its peak to convey the genre of the action thriller as if the film were to continue. It would have so many peaks such as so, and done. Wow, that was a lot. Moreover, I want to talk about the creative decision-making made throughout the journey of production. So let's start with the mistakes. In pre-production, before scouting on Google Earth for multiple grass fields, I had already settled on one near my residence. However, my colleague Asher pointed out to me that that grass field was an air park with planes that would constantly be flying around, which would have been incredibly stupid and dangerous to pull off because we had to take a drone shot, which would have caused my friend's drone not only to break, but also putting anyone who was flying in danger, as well as ourselves. Rookie mistake, obviously. I also had the limitation on gear, such as barely any light equipment for the first location. We only had the lights from our phone and one supplied to us with the candles and light bulb in the ceiling, which in the future I will account for, as even with the already cinematic lighting displayed in the film, there's some moments where the lighting feels dull. I also made the mistake of taking our time for granted. Our first day of filming was way ahead of schedule than anyone else's in the media studies subject, so we obviously had a lead against everyone else. However, as the weekends passed on with missed opportunities to film, it gradually got to the point where when me and Asher started thinking to film, we got unlucky with nearly every weekend because we couldn't film on weekdays due to school, or at least one of us couldn't make it. In the end, we got to the second part of filming done, but already after the production stage had ended, so a thing to improve on is definitely to not take time for granted. However, even with all the mistakes, we also learned a lot too. In the pre-production stage, I tested many shots that would be used in the film at school, with my friends available to act in it, to see the perception of each shot and know if the idea of the shot would really work, which went pretty well. As well as after the first day of editing and showing it to peers, I received a ton of feedback that would go into the second round of editing, and overall improved the film quite decently. Overall, for the skill improvement, it was just trial and error. We really learned what we shouldn't have done and should have kept doing. Now, let's move on to question 4. We are now on the last question, and I should mention the hardware that I used during the production of the opening title sequence. Firstly, for my camera, I used the DJI Osmo Pocket 3. It's a great action camera that specializes in its stability. It's a compact 3-axis gimbal camera with 4K and 120 FPS footage, making for a professional look. However, for the film, I filmed at 2K and 30 FPS footage, so yeah. I bought the bundle with a camera as well, as that includes a short tripod, a wide-angle lens, a microphone, and the case. For the Dutch angle shot, we used an iPhone 16 at the same quality because of the camera's inability to rotate left or right. For the microphone, as mentioned before, I used the microphone that came with the bundle, which is a DJI Mic 2, a dual-channel wireless mic with noise cancelling and a range of up to 250 meters. We used the microphone to record some crispy diegetic sound that came from the footage to avoid the step of finding diegetic noise on another application. The recordings of audio came out well, such as the footsteps from the guards and the paper being thrown. For the lighting, we should split into 2 sections correlating to the 2 different locations. And for the first area, we used artificial lighting, supplied by the room that included the light bulbs in the ceiling for cold lighting and the candles for warmer lighting that contrast each other very nicely. We also used phones for extra artificial lighting, where we could use the flashlights for more cold lighting. For tripods, we had the short tripod and another actual tripod, as well as bringing a skateboard. You might be wondering why and how I could use a skateboard as a tripod for stabilization. Well, for the guards' first scene where they walk towards camera, I positioned myself in front of them on the skateboard as I filmed them while stepping back to move the skateboard backwards, which worked well decently. The only problems were that the floor wasn't very flat and I had to make sure I was treading backwards straight and not slightly turning left or right, or else it would look unprofessional. To end question 4, let's mention feedback. As mentioned before, after the first day of editing, I had feedback from multiple people, including my colleague and the protagonist of the film, Kian, my media teacher, Mr. Powell, and my dad and mother. Kian told me that the text hadn't fit the genre of the action thriller convention, and after inspection, it did look kind of out of place. Then my media teacher, Mr. Powell, informed me that it was looking great and that I could add more diegetic sounds for even more realism, and my parents' suggestion of grammar fixes for the text and compliments on the sound design. All of this was then completed in the second round of editing after me and Asher went back to his house right after filming from the second location, in which I can say these suggestions helped out a ton, and I'm grateful I asked for feedback. And that is my creative critical reflection done. I completed this one day before the deadline, so I'm thankful I actually got it done. Yeah, that's the end. End video.
All right, Breakout. So my initial thoughts really reminds me of films such as like Pulp Fiction, this kind of enigma of what is being sought after, what's trying to be found, who are these people and what's the relationship between them. So very, very mysterious, like from the offset, which is nice and intriguing. As an audience member, I'm like immediately brought in. Equally very ambitious with the use of low light. As a cinematographer myself, it's very difficult to convey information in a dimly lit setting, and use of low-key lighting is extremely difficult to set up. So yeah, really nice to see that being challenged and utilized as well. I like just the use of a simple soundscape. That silence is really eerie and kind of unsettling, so the audience is, kind of on their toes throughout the entirety of the opening title sequence. As far as other kind of technical aspects, I really enjoy the text. The use of text, the stylization of text is nice and kind of reminds me of like The Godfather, that kind of sharp text, especially the A's that are not fully closed, is just very nice and unique. And I think very appropriate to the genre of mystery thriller. But there seems to be this element of action. Got the kind of running man throughout. What's he running from, or is he running to something? All of these questions very, very thought-provoking for the audience and makes for an enjoyable watch.